Hi everyone, I'm Vanessa, marketing lead at Adina, and you're listening to The Beauty Curtain. This is the podcast that draws back the curtain on the beauty and personal care industry. And today we're back with Jasper, Managing Director of SKU, leading contract manufacturers creating beauty and personal care products that redefine industry standards. So to get to know Jasper a bit more, make sure to watch our first episode. The link will be down in the description box below. But today we're going to chat all things sustainability, from packaging to the supply chain and the future of manufacturing. So welcome back to the podcast, Jasper.
Thanks, Vanessa. Nice to see you again. Looking forward to this one.
Yeah, definitely. This is going to be a great episode. And I think to start off, we should go back to basics a little bit. So as well as established brands, SKU also works with scaling brands. And I would love to know what the process is of developing a new product with them.
There's quite a rigorous process for formulation and testing, sort of well known in the industry. Obviously, everything needs to be safe, but that's kind of the less exciting part. So the bit there where we get a real kick is at the sort of briefing stage, where we're exploring concepts with people, trying to make sure that things slot into the brand story and the ethos. And then typically over a period of time, there'll be a number of samples going back and forth with the customer, like making sure that we're hitting brief and we're continually sort of iterating on what's required. After that period, we go through a sort of 12-week testing process. That's a legal requirement. And this is part that I think is quite an interesting one to share with people, because it gives us like total oversight on how the product is performing in various conditions. So we submit it. We basically create samples, and they go in little glass pots. And we have one in window light, one in 20 degrees, one in 5 degrees, one in 40 degrees, and then there's a freeze thaw trial. So samples are left in a freezer basically, and they get pulled out at each 4-week test point. And that gives us, it's called accelerated testing, but it gives us a really good overview of how that product's going to perform in different circumstances, so that when we get to market, we don't see any adverse reactions. That bit's all obviously sort of pre-production, and during that time, packaging's selected, which I think we're going to go into a bit today. But the real fun starts at scaling up, essentially. So quite a lot of the scale up's done in the lab, and then at various size mixing tanks until we get to like real scale level. But there's lots of learnings to do along that process, and checking back to make sure that the formulation is completely matching what was signed off at the development stage. Packaging's an interesting one in regard to, there's some very standard formats of packs, but we can see challenges, especially in this modern world where we've got so many different formats of packaging. We know we've got capabilities to fill aluminium tubes, plastic tubes, all shapes and sizes of bottles, and gable top cartons now. But you get to a point where you think there's nothing we don't know about now, and things are continuing to emerge, which is a really exciting time to be in. That's where half the innovation is, I'd say, in packaging at the moment. The other half obviously being in the formulation, which is a complex picture.
That must be so exciting to see that whole process through all the testing, choosing the packaging, and then to see that product actually go to market.
Hugely. I think the excitement doesn't wear off, and I think I can safely speak on behalf of the team for this as well. Every time something new goes on the lines, it is a really exciting moment, and it's just you're part of something that's growing and an industry that's growing. So yeah, it's a great place to be. Very fortunate. Can
you share like a memorable example of when this has gone really well, and like maybe without mentioning any brand names, but a time when you've been super excited about a project going to market?
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, it's not all smooth sailing, but I've got a couple of moments in my mind that were sort of cornerstone for us as a business, and also hopefully for the brands that was relevant to. We had a super tight lead time to get some new products to market for a brand that was growing really quickly, and like record formulation time, and then we sort of scaled this up into some packaging that was a new format for us as well, and we did that in a super concentrated time period. There was a lot of collaboration with the customer in that regard, which I think is also why it was such a great thing to be involved with. And yes, super grateful to have gone through that process. But as I say, not everything is like that. And I could probably give you a couple of examples of things that weren't so smooth sailing as well, if you'd like them.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'd love to know what some of those situations have looked like.
It tends to be with packaging. Obviously, talks about the formulation process, and there's quite a strict protocol that we follow for that to make sure that everything is exactly right in the packs. Where we can sometimes have more trouble is with things like labels and print as well, in terms of making sure it's getting applied to the packaging properly. We don't print internally. There are a couple of examples of things which might seem so trivial at the time you're developing a product, but can really impact the customer experience down the line. And it's something that is worth spending the time and the forethought on before you get to that part of the process.
So what can be challenging about that? Because I guess that's something that I'm not sure maybe scaling brands might not have thought of, like labels and packaging. I think they maybe would have thought of in, a few ways. But yeah, I'd love to know more about that.
Yeah, sure. Look, there's so many great packaging suppliers out there now, and ultimately it can be as simple as making sure that you're using a reputable company for that, because we've third party print, for example, and it's not worked out the way that either us or the customers wanted it to be. We've got a list of approved suppliers that we go to, and I think that sort of gives a layer of comfort to us, because ultimately at the point when a product's being filled or packed, you really don't want to be worrying about the packaging quality and integrity.
Also, in terms of maybe sustainability and packaging, is that something that you help these scaling brands and established brands navigate too?
Yes, I think so. And I think that we definitely offer input there, and we've definitely built a strong pool of thoughts about that as a business as well. And it's something that I think prior to even working in this industry, I've always found super interesting. But, ultimately the brand is responsible for how they rank that in terms of their priority. And the other thing to consider here is that it's not a straightforward thing. Sustainability isn't a straightforward thing. And while it's a term that gets banded around at the moment, it's not always cut and dry. And I think it'd be good to explore that today, because it's a full picture, it's not one or two things.
Yeah, let's dive into that then, because sustainability is obviously a huge movement at the moment, and we're seeing brands left, right, and center embracing sustainability in different ways, from packaging to formulation. We've also seen greenwashing, we've seen greenhushing. There's a lot going on. So, firstly, have you seen an obvious shift in brands embracing sustainability? And then maybe we'll get on to your definition of that.
There's no doubt that over the last few years, this has become a priority for most brands. We're almost picking a cause at the minute to roll with, and I think that's something that should be considered in a bit more detail. You mentioned greenwashing earlier. I think that there's a few occurrences where people are genuinely greenwashing just to shift product or get themselves SEO ranked, for example. But I think the reality of the situation is that because it is such a complex picture, we can actually end up having a far bigger impact on something because we've tried to solve one problem without a holistic view of that full picture.
Before we get into that holistic view, what is your interpretation of sustainability? What does it really mean, in your opinion?
It's sort of rolling on from the holistic aspect. For me, it's so important that you are taking consideration of as many of the elements that are in your control as possible. We've got upstream processes, like how the plastic's manufactured, for example, how the aluminium's manufactured, how the pack's produced. There's our part in the middle, which is production, and production CO2 costs, production, wastage, that sort of thing, which we try really hard to manage and reduce where possible. But I believe that the biggest problem at the moment is the downstream aspect of packaging. And it's something that I know is a hot topic at the moment. You know, do we use plastic that can be widely recycled but often isn't? How's the consumer getting rid of the packaging after its use? I think that's where the focus should be at the moment, really.
So just to clarify, by downstream, you mean on the consumer end?
Yeah, exactly. So downstream being anything that's happened from my perspective, it's anything that's happened sort of post the product leaving us, essentially.
So what are you doing at SKU to make sure that you're integrating sustainability downstream?
A lot of this happens at the sort of development stage again, and selecting the right packaging. There's a whole formulation discussion here, which I think is probably too complex to discuss in this session. You know, there's so many materials inside the product which people are becoming conscious of and is becoming a hot topic, and then it's not anymore. And that sort of cycle, I think, will continue forevermore. But what is certain for me is that actually you need to create a product which is easy for someone to recycle or compost after its use. And there's also an infrastructure conversation there to be had about how people can get access to that really easily.
I think firstly, let's start with maybe designing for end of life. What responsibility do you think contract manufacturers have and brands have in making sure that the consumer downstream can recycle the product, can compost it?
You know, there's such a plethora of information out there about how we can process things downstream. I think that often it's as simple as making sure someone can recycle something at home. But part of that conversation as well is what state does the product need to be in for that to happen. Plastic, for example, is very difficult to recycle if it's dirty. Not many people rinse out plastic bottles before recycling, post-use. And I think that as a brand, it's quite a difficult conversation, to be honest, in some cases, because you can try and optimize a product for customer experience, and ultimately, if you aren't selling the product, it's very difficult to make any positive or negative environmental impact. And I think that's something that's it's sometimes overlooked. It's ultimately the product has to be purchased in scale to actually start making this impact.
Do you think on an infrastructure level, the UK need to be doing more to help with this?
Yeah, I think undoubtedly it should be far easier for people to recycle. We're seeing an emergence of things like flexible plastic recycling in supermarkets and things like that, but there's still countries who are importing our waste to process as recycling, and ultimately that's leaving the UK supply chain, is going somewhere else. And I think it's also evidence of the fact that things are very difficult to recycle in the UK on the whole. For some figures, I mean, only 46% of plastic packs are actually recycled in the UK, which I think is an alarmingly low rate, especially when we know what impact it has on the ocean and the wildlife around us.
So why aren't these being recycled in the UK? What are the challenges?
Honestly, I think that there's a multitude of factors, as there is with anything. There's sometimes one root cause, but I think it leads on from a few different things. I think the culture for recycling in the UK is not strong enough at the moment. And actually, that's probably led by the infrastructure around it and the lack of ease for getting that waste back into a system where we can recycle. The statistics are probably slightly warped there because plastic packaging is far more prevalent. So ultimately, there's a chance that less of it is going to get recycled. But I think that percentage for us as a country is far lower than A, some of our peers in Europe, and B, far lower than it should be.
So how do we change this? How do we move forward? Is this about educating the consumer? Is this about less plastic?
The first thing from my perspective, if I was in that seat making that decision, would be understanding what plays into sustainability. It's a word that is thrown around in all aspects of our daily life at the minute, but ultimately we've got people trying to make products ocean safe. Everyone wants to reduce carbon emissions, water usage. Some people want the product to be vegan. everyone wants it to be cruelty free. And then we've got this whole, the list goes on and on. It's like, are we trying to reduce petrochemical usage? But ultimately, I don't think it's right to consider one of those things in isolation. And I do think that there needs to be a combined picture and fuller understanding of what impact this is having on both carbon emissions and usage and the energy that's required to go into something, and then what the customer can do with it down the line. Plastic and aluminium is a debate that I love to have because it's, aluminium's emerging more as a material at the moment in packaging. And I think it's a super interesting conversation because we've got this, this huge plastic discussion going on at the minute. No one wants to see plastic in the ocean. There's a serious question to ask about whether we can actually backtrack from the damage that's been done there. But, there's a wider conversation because while plastic is very easy to manufacture, it does use petrochemicals. Aluminium, on the other hand, is much, much more energy intensive to manufacture and requires some natural resources. But if we look at this as a system rather than trying to solve one problem, aluminium, if it is discarded in the environment, has a far lower impact. And ultimately, if we can manage to recycle as much aluminium as possible, it reduces that footprint on the planet by 90% as opposed to plastic. The thing we love about aluminium and metals in general is that you can recycle those an infinite amount of times. It doesn't ever lose its integrity. As well with plastic, you have to keep reintroducing fresh material to the process. Otherwise, at some point, the packaging will fail in manufacturing and it's not viable for use. So if we take that as almost a timeline and trying to understand whether we can create a loop from this packaging scenario that we've got going on, aluminium's a real unsung hero for me because it would, in a theoretical world, allow us to keep that material back in the system. There's lots of other things to consider there. Plastic is very difficult to recycle if it's not clean. Yes, there's washing processes and recycling plants, but with aluminium, because of the temperature it gets up to, you essentially get all the impurities rising to the top and it can just be scraped off. So there's all those things to consider. And I think that it's a difficult thing to make a decision on just based on one of these factors. It's a difficult thing to balance properly. And I do wonder if it's time for a combined standard in the beauty industry. I'd love to see someone coming up with that, where we've got a way of measuring all these factors and actually analysing and quantifying them to a point where we can make a decision based on data rather than based on what people like in a marketing story. We live in a time with just what would have previously been seen as an infinite amount of technology at the minute. And I'd love to see at some point that we can harness AI and we can harness all these digital technologies that we've got to come up with a way of measuring this effectively and giving us some genuine data back that people can make decisions on.
Before we get into the certification that you've mentioned, aluminium sounds like the perfect solution in terms of packaging. Why are we not seeing our shelves covered in aluminium? It seems like I've seen a few hand soap brands that are now embracing using cans in aluminium, but you still see most packaging is made from plastic.
Yeah, you do for sure. It's definitely on the rise. We can see that walking around the shelves, but there's a couple of reasons for this. The first one is it's not to everyone's taste, and as soon as you start using an aluminium tube, it loses its shape, and there are people that don't like that on the shelves. I think it's great, and I like to see, a patina building up on a product for me. There's also the fact that actually it's quite difficult to move that product through production in a way that's not damaging the pack. So there's definitely a conversation there for the supplier and the manufacturer. We do see that there's a slightly higher cost to aluminium tubes at times, but it's very marginal. But the real big thing is that if consumers aren't completely used to using something, it doesn't tend to get a big enough uptake. So I think all of these conversations that we're having today are not stuff that we can flick a switch and make a change overnight, because a lot of it's about behavior and people learning what's good and what they like and exploring different things. You know, the fact that we mentioned earlier is ultimately things like solid shampoo can be tricky, because it's such a foreign concept. You know, you've got to get that in someone's hands to try it and them to enjoy it. Otherwise, ultimately, they are going to switch back.
So whose responsibility do you think it is to kind of drive this behavioral change? Do you think it's for the consumer to learn how to use these products? Do you think it's for the beauty brands to just push them? How do we manage this?
I think it's easy to blame infrastructure. It's easy to blame the government. But we have all got a responsibility. Ultimately, we're all living in this world at the minute, and we should be recycling more. We should be taking more care of how we're purchasing things, what we believe to be good, because ultimately, as consumers, we have a big part to play in driving that change. The press have an arguably even bigger part to play, and I would love to see more consideration and more data going into the decisions that are deciding the decisions that are driving the marketing stories behind these things, because it's very easy to get sucked into a vortex where you've seen something and you think it's the right move, and then all of a sudden you sort of realize that there's this big gap there that we've not considered. But for me, infinitely recyclable or completely compostable would be the sort of ideal scenario that we'd see over the next 10 years that really come into fruition.
I'm quite surprised that you've mentioned the press and marketing stories. How much do these really influence the decisions that beauty brands and contract manufacturers make?
Well, look at the supermarkets. I mean, I wasn't around 40 years ago, but from what I've heard, they're a little bit slimmer on stock, and there were nowhere near as many options. The fact is that the decision making and at the retail end is very often driven by price. We're not always looking at quality in most cases, and that price can quite often be driven just by complete efficiency in the manufacturing process, which doesn't always or doesn't very often give you the best sustainability solution. The supermarkets have given us an almost infinite arrangement of things to choose from, but they've also been very influential in what should be put in front of customers to buy, and that does change mindset over time. It does change the way that we buy and the way that we utilize all the products that we've got in the bathroom.
Let's talk about some of these marketing stories. I'd love to know what stories brands are pushing at the moment, kind of what sustainability trends they're leaning into as well.
Refillable is the first thing that comes to mind. We're working with a great brand at the minute that are essentially trying to reinvent how we use bathroom products into a completely refillable package. So I think that's an amazing balance between having a really high quality pack that lasts such a long time and also a super low carbon footprint sort of thing that it comes in. And it's also got the added bonus that you've usually got some spare shower gel or hand wash under the sink that you can top up with. I think that's something that is certainly quite useful to me as an unorganised, busy person, is to have a little bit spare in the bathroom. We've got smaller refill packs. Airless pumps are becoming very common, a very common contender in that market. If you sort of walk into Boots now, for the first time ever, really, you can buy a product with a beautiful glass or otherwise package and buy refill canisters separately. I think that's a very good interim solution to a problem that we're trying to solve. The other conversation is completely compostable at home compostable packs. There's a number of companies I can think of who are literally investing millions into this at the moment, and I'd love to see that that's something that we're swapping maybe plastic jars out for example, and that will start to make that sustainable like the sustainable decision a lot easier, because at the moment there's very few options that are like a good fit, that take up the form of something that everyone's used to, like a glass jar, for example, or a plastic jar, and are just easily and readily accessible. Because, we're still going through this process of understanding how to manufacture these things, understanding how to create them in a way that makes them very easy to discard and compost or recycle downstream, but doesn't affect the product at all for the life cycle of it being sat in the bathroom. That's a tricky balance to find, because you want something that's going to degrade, but not quickly enough for it to degrade with your product in it. There's a company called Tubex who've come up with this fantastic aluminium tube, and it's basically completely aluminium, really high quality, with a sort of flexible but lower, from what I can tell, it's a slightly less like aluminium content tube, but the lid is basically part of the aluminium tubes. There's no plastic in it whatsoever, and it's something that they're pushing as a refill system. I think that's fantastic. It's like, we've talked about aluminium today, and I'd love to see that being more prevalent in the future. But yeah, refills and aluminium and compostable are definitely the way we're moving at the minute.
So kind of leading back to my question when I said, why are the supermarket shelves not full of aluminium? Do you think it really is that we're just not there yet in terms of technology? Because I think you mentioned that Tubex, they now have the pump, which is made of aluminium. I think that's one thing that we didn't quite see, that even these glass jars still had plastic pumps.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so it's part of the cap, basically, or is the cap for this Tubex one. I think this is a sort of cyclical thing. We've come from an era where everything was in aluminium or glass because they were arguably the easiest things to manufacture. We've sort of moved back to plastic because it's easier to produce and it's easier to fill and get out to customers in a state that we want. But, things go through cycles, don't they? And we're now learning about the impact that these plastic packs have had. So I do think that aluminium, and probably glass as well, is going to come back to the forefront before too long, to be honest.
I'm glad that you've taken more of a holistic outlook on sustainability. But we've definitely mentioned a lot about packaging and manufacturing. I'd love to know how elsewhere in the supply chain is sustainability integrated, or how it can be integrated.
UK manufacture is always a good thing. It's not always readily available, especially at high volumes. I can probably count on one hand the number of actual packaging suppliers in the UK. I'd love to see more of that, because ultimately, if we can make it here, we're not taking up container space shipping from overseas. We've also got what's in the pack to consider, and how that's getting manufactured. Reduction of waste is a huge thing. It's something that is not difficult to manage, but I think that when when there's a focus on output, waste reduction can sometimes take a back seat. I think as a manufacturer, it's something that you are acutely aware of, but driving that down, and that goes for the waste product from the packaging itself being manufactured. We also see in quite a few cases that the packs themselves will come into us with huge amounts of plastic around them. In some cases, packs that are supposed to be super sustainable. Another thing I love about aluminium tubes is that they come in a cardboard box, sometimes with a small plastic bag around them, but it's super low input into that packaging. There's some things that do arrive with bags and plastic trays separating all the packs out. So that's just something to consider as a brand owner, is like take a look at that and see if there's things that can be reduced there. Downstream, we need to focus on formulations at some point and go, what's going down the drain, because that's getting into water systems. That's not going away anytime soon. We've seen a great change in sort of banning of microbeads, that sort of thing, and there's lots of alternatives that are natural for, in this particular case, exfoliants, for example. There's loads of sort of upcycle products that you do as good ads, if not even better job than those plastic beads were, for example. We're making good progress. I think that more can be done, but I do think there's a lot of people far more intelligent than I looking at ways we can manage this situation better.
So when brands come to you, are you seeing them ask about the whole supply chain? Are they taking a holistic view?
I think that some brands do. Some brands look at the whole process from start to finish. I think that it's a difficult balancing act at the moment. That holistic view is very difficult to get a full picture of. It's called a supply chain for a reason. There's so many different aspects to it. There's things that can be done with raw materials to sort of, know that you're reducing impact. Palm oils are probably less of a hot topic than it used to be, but I think it's a super important one. We've got something that's an incredible thickener and an incredible feedstock that actually we've not grown in a responsible way, and that's led to this huge backlash about don't use palm oil in anything. Head over to the RSPO website. There's a far more in-depth article than this, but in essence, it's so effective at what it does that the next closest thing would be something like coconut oil. You would need to decimate millions more acres of land to get the same amount of efficacy than you do palm oil. So actually, stopping using palm oil is kicking the can down the road and making it a problem for another year for someone else to uncover. So, the decisions should be getting investigated in more detail, I think, before we start pulling the pin on stuff.
What are brands asking for the most at the moment? So you've mentioned palm and packaging, carbon emissions. I'd love to know which part of the supply chains they seem to be focusing on.
Refill packs, for sure, at the moment. I think that's something that we're getting a lot of discussions and requests about, of different sizes. We've got the bathroom and the sort of sink top products like hand washes and lotions, which in some cases are coming in larger format refill packs, which I think is a good initiative. And it again, down to the skincare products. And I think we're still in a time where people are very conscious about excluding things from formulations, which in some cases is a really good thing. Can make it a challenge to formulate at times, being so locked into this framework of what the press think is good and bad. And you look at some of the data and think this isn't quite accurate, but we'll run with it because people need to buy the product at the end of the day.
You mentioned there's an element of following what the press think is good and think is bad. Do you think that brands prioritize the press and what we're seeing in the media over the data? For example, back in the day, there was a huge wave of you can't use silicones and can't put sulfate in your hair. And I know for myself as a curly girl, I did not use silicones for about 10 years. But we're seeing a resurgence of them because of the real data. Does that happen a lot? Is that quite common?
Yeah, for sure. I think some things go in cycles just because it's not hot off the press at the minute. It's a good thing to consider. The second point, like going back to your question there, is I think as a brand with limited budget and a lower risk tolerance, it's very difficult to make that call to run against the grain. And I feel sometimes there's a bit of a gap. We've got the staunch sustainability, organic, natural brands who sometimes like really make a go of it, and we see around. But as a scaling brand that are trying to get their name out there, it's super difficult to go, well, we're gonna throw out like everything that the press is saying about this, and we're going to make our own decisions based on data, because ultimately you've got to educate people before you can sell that product to them. So if people don't understand what it's truly about and what's truly going on, they're very unlikely to buy it. You've got a limited amount of attention span from people unless you market it beautifully and can educate them over a period of time. It can be really tricky to run against the grain.
So it seems like there's still a way to go. in terms of brands maybe pushing their own agenda in terms of sustainability instead of following maybe trends or the media. I would love to know, let's say in 10 years' time, what do you think the role of sustainability will be in manufacturing, and what is the ideal?
Well, in manufacturing, we've talked about reducing carbon emissions and waste. That's got to be the priority in that aspect, and also helping support customers with making those decisions. I'd really love to see that, in the next 5 years, we've got this standard for measuring the impact of beauty products. I mean, globally, the beauty industry is producing 120 million tonnes of carbon emissions a year, which is about 0.5% of total global emissions. So we've got a lot to answer for, really. And we're in a world of fast fashion and fast beauty. I think that we should try and assess and understand what products we're digesting in a bit more detail as a consumer. And I think that brands should be really looking at the big picture, as I've mentioned a few times now, and say that, we're starting to make these incremental changes towards a better option, which still suits our customers' requirements, because there are plenty. And there are simple ways of getting stuff out in people's hands. Like we look at sampling a lot. Sachets have typically been the go-to option. Aluminium tubes, in my opinion, are a way more sustainable option in that regard, and are also a good way of getting that in people's hands to try and go, okay, I actually quite like aluminium tubes now, I can roll with this.
I'd love to go back to the certification or the standard that you brought up. I don't know if you've seen that recently the EU have done a whole new, have put together all new legislation on kind of greenwashing and stopping greenwashing, to make sure that in Europe people have very particular packaging in terms of sustainability claims. I'd love to know firstly what you think of that, and what would a certification or a global standard maybe look like?
Firstly, I'm interested to learn about that because it's the first I've heard of it. But for me, I think that there's hard lines to put on things sometimes, and I know the EU are making big progress, like removing the lightning port from the iPhone, sort of banning that for Apple, and that is going to save waste over a number of years, I don't doubt. But I also think that the information that we provide to the consumer is in some cases just as important. And my vision for this standard is not to say this absolutely complies with it, we're good to go, you've got completely bulletproof recyclable packaging, like there's nothing wrong with this product, because there's always a downside, and we just need to pick the fewest downside solutions, so the solution with the fewest downsides. And I think it'd be really interesting to have a standard which, rather than just saying this complies or this doesn't, actually ranks the solution based on the factors that are feeding into it, because it's a picture that should be driven by data and isn't at the moment. And I'd love to see that thing where the consumer can pick it up and go, hey, it's like Michelin stars. It's like, it's in the good food guide, great. Or it's got 1, 2 or 3 stars. Like, I know how good this is now. I've got a barometer to judge it by. Because you don't, we live in such a busy world now. Like, people don't have time to sit and research this stuff, but it should be presented in a way that is easy to get across and easy to interpret. And I'd really love to see that being the standard in 10 years' time.
I agree. I do think that a global beauty standard or certification, as you were mentioning, could really help the end consumer at least make a more informed decision. So I think this is a good place to end the episode. I think everyone will agree that it's been super informative and we've covered some amazing topics. Thanks so much for joining us, Jasper. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching. Thank you to Harrison for producing this podcast. All the information about SKU, more information about Jasper will be in the description box below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, follow us, all that good stuff, and we'll see you in the next one.